last night it was the Jets yet again in a primetime spot facing off against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had their second Sunday night football appearance in the past 3 weeks. And ultimately, we got a lot of intrigue in this game in terms of how would both of these rosters look now that they made their big-time changes. The Steelers made the largely unpopular opinion to a lot of NFL fans to ride with Russell Wilson now as the starting quarterback. A little bit more of an experiment than a commitment, but he ultimately took the helm for the Steelers. He looked pretty good, and we're going to be diving into his performance in particular. We also saw the New York Jets with their new piece in Davante Adams, and their offense still kind of more the same there. But I do want to start on a little bit more of the optimistic side and talk about the Steelers, who last night were able to win 37-15, put up the most amount of points that they've put up all season long, in large part due to what was a very solid Russell Wilson performance. He was 16 of 29 for 264 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. He also got in as well on a QB sneak for a rushing touchdown, so accounted for 3 touchdowns in his season debut. Did not seem that was going to be the case based off of how the first quarter and a half went for the most part, but ultimately he got more comfortable as the game went along, and I think that the biggest difference that I noticed, at least on first watch, with this Steelers offense from previous weeks with Justin Fields to this week now with Wilson is the ability to take some more of those deep shots with maybe a little bit higher frequency and success rate. Now, I'm not going to say that Russell Wilson was flawless in this game and on some of these deep shots, because the truth of the matter, for me at least, is that I thought that, he was making a lot of these deep shots to, or as Chris Collinsworth continued to call them, these moon balls, moon shots, something like that. Kind of funny from the broadcast there, but, putting those high arcing throws down the field, giving his wide receiver a chance to make a play, and ultimately, they weren't perfect throws, but George Pickens is a good enough wide receiver that if you give him a high enough volume of those 50-50 balls down the field, he's going to make plays. And that's exactly what he did for the Steelers last night, where we've still kind of been waiting on Pickens to, fully emerge this season into the receiver that we know that he can be. Now, in defense to Pickens and a little bit to Justin Fields as well, the Steelers were converting on some of these opportunities, and yet penalties called back a good 2 or 3 in the first few weeks that I noticed. So it's not like Justin Fields is incapable of making those types of throws, especially because I don't think that a lot of them were particularly excellent. Wilson did have one throw down the right sideline where, I forget exactly who he was throwing to. It might have been Pickens, through a little bit extra pressure there. Ultimately didn't result in a catch. It was a penalty that ensued as well. But, Russell Wilson, he definitely had his moments last night, and certainly he earned his opportunity to continue to start for the Steelers. Now, again, this is not a strict commitment to Russell Wilson. Mike Tomlin hasn't necessarily given us any reason to believe that, this is set in stone, that Wilson unquestionably will have the starting job moving forward. But I thought that ultimately, the way that their schedule kind of shapes out here, it's against the Jets and against the Giants. 2 good, not excellent defenses. And really, I think 2 games would be the proper sample size for Wilson and for the Steelers to sort of evaluate that. And ultimately, I wasn't totally sure if he was going to make it to next week as the starter still, but once he started getting rolling, thought that there was a lot of good. And, it's been a lot easier for Steelers quarterbacks these past couple weeks, where Najee Harris has sort of emerged with a couple of huge games these past couple weeks. Last night, 21 carries for 102 yards and a touchdown. You just see the fact that he is bouncing off of defenders. He's never been the speediest, and he's frankly never fully lived up to being drafted in the first round, which is, I think, why a lot of people ding him. maybe the Steelers overdrafted him a little bit in 2021, but I still don't think that Najee has been any sort of a bad running back. And now that he is playing in an offense that is a little bit more spaced out, has some more competency at the quarterback position, we're starting to see him build up some momentum. Now, obviously going to have to sustain that for the entire season. We're still just a few weeks removed from 19 yards on 13 carries, so it's not like Najee is this entirely new player, but he's been playing very well over the course largely in the past month, then that's something to take into consideration as well with the Steelers offense. So again, with Wilson, I'm not necessarily willing to commit to a take of he or Justin Fields are better off for the position. The reality of the situation is I do still feel like Wilson and Fields are along the same lines in terms of overall skill level. It's about what fit best slides into what the Steelers are trying to do. What do they want their offensive identity to be? And while Justin Fields, he has a lot of the highs in terms of him being mobile, him being able to be a factor in the run game, so, some of these design runs, and especially in the red zone. That being said, though, the red zone efficiency hasn't been great for the Steelers up to this point in the season. Russell Wilson last night able to lead the Steelers to a pretty good red zone touchdown percentage. They went 4 of 6 last night. Definitely a positive to build off of. And again, like I mentioned, those more frequent downfield shots. Something that I thought is sort of worth noting as well. We highlighted this weeks ago now with Justin Fields' first few starts, where early on it was very much centered around throwing to the outside, not targeting the middle of the field, and that's where we saw Fields start to have some of his issues as the season went on. Russell Wilson last night, similar to Fields, 0 passes at or inside the hash marks in the middle of the field. So I feel like we are probably going to see the Steelers sort of loosen up the restrictions on him a little bit next week against the Giants and just sort of see what they have there. Because like I mentioned, it's the Jets and then the Giants, 2 good, not great defenses, and then it's a bye week. And then really from that point on, I do feel like the Steelers have to commit to one direction or another. Right now, I mean, it's not perfect, but they had a little bit of wiggle room based off of some early season success that they were able to sort of take their time with this decision. Tomlin, again, still hasn't set anything in stone up to this point, but the offense looked very good last night, 409 yards. Russell Wilson looked good, and for whatever it works, for whatever it's worth, you see some of the shots that were taken on the sideline last night of it's George Pickens with his arms around Russell Wilson and Najee Harris. The team seems to be resonating there. Again, just a 1-game sample size. We'll see, but I think Steelers fans should be feeling pretty optimistic about how last night went for them and with Russell Wilson moving forward. Now, on the other side of this, the New York Jets. Really disappointing game from them, of course. It's the entire situation is the reality of the situation, and their defense has been good at times, but more times than not, we've seen them struggle to protect the run. Their secondary has been dealing with injuries all season long as well, so they're not getting quite the lockdown coverage that they were anticipating coming into the season on the back end. So, defense, not great. We already knew that. The offense taking very little steps forward is definitely discouraging, and for whatever it's worth as well, I'll have to go back and rewatch another time. This one felt like it was very much on Aaron Rodgers. And it's not just him. The running game still does not exist for them. Now, Breece Hall was at least involved in some of those short screens and such, that it's not like he was an entire non-factor. But we continue to see the lack of production from a run game that should have a lot more behind it. And, that's a huge factor, and a huge reason why they weren't able to come out on top last night. I mean, they were up in this game. I believe it was 15-6 before they let the Steelers rattle off however many unanswered points it would have been, something along the lines of, if my math is mathing up right now, 31 unanswered. So that's just inexcusable. And it's inexcusable really on all fronts. And as for Davante Adams and what kind of an addition he was for the Jets, week 1, the answer would be not much, where 3 catches for just 30 yards, and that was it. 9 targets. So we saw literally from the first play, a little bit of it was a bit of a misfire from Rodgers, a little bit more to the outside, very much catchable from Davante Adams, but he wasn't able to bring that in, and it just a little bit was indicative of what the night was as a whole. And I'm not saying it was all entirely bad. The thought process is that Davante Adams, maybe a little bit of rust, hadn't played in a couple weeks, dealing with this hamstring injury, assuming that it is a real injury and not an excuse to not play for the Raiders, but that Davante Adams can eventually become a bigger part of the offense. The broadcast was highlighting it last night, the amount of separation and single coverage looks that Garrett Wilson on the other side was able to sort of generate for himself there, that definitely some positives involved there, but I think that it just gets harder and harder as these weeks move on to completely, to not blame Aaron Rodgers, and I'm not putting it entirely on his plate, but it just feels like for weeks now we've had all of these excuses for Rodgers, for a lot of the Jets truthers out there. And the reality is, I just don't think that he's looked sharp. I don't think he's looked comfortable in the pocket when he does have to deal with pressure. Again, last night, I thought the Jets' offensive line actually did a pretty good job, all things considered, protecting him, especially considering the fact that they were down to their third-string right guard at one point as well, due to a couple injuries. And they really cannot find a way to get a downfield passing attack going for them. And you look at Breece Hall was able to get the vast majority of the yards for Rodgers. 109 or 103 yards, receiving, so not technically the majority, but a very large chunk of those. And they were screenplays. It's not like they were Aaron Rodgers doing anything all that spectacular, even though I do think that Collinsworth even called one of those screen passes to Breece Hall that went for a big break spectacular. It's just not what I'm seeing at this point. And, now that he has Davante Adams in the building, I think that he can have something that is a little bit more muscle memory that he can lean on, that he trusts that relationship between him and Davante. But ultimately, this feels like a Jets season that's falling from the waist down. And you look at what their schedule is moving forward for the remainder of the season. Like we talked about before, I do think that this is a wild card race in the AFC that is wide open. Heavy at the top, I think at the bottom, a lot more variety there in terms of what you're going to get. The Jets are going to need to turn this around ASAP on a 4-game losing streak, currently 2-5. The Dolphins, I believe right now, are ahead of them in the AFC East standings. They have a game this upcoming weekend against the Patriots that has to be a get-right game for them, that the Patriots are just a bad football team, and there's really no excuses. It's not a game that I think anybody can come out of that and feel great about the Jets, but we just need to see them do the simple things right. Just make sure that there is, something still in there. At the end of the day, I don't think that the Jets are a great team. I don't have them as a Super Bowl contender. They are capable of being a playoff team. In order to show that, though, you got to do it against the weaker competition first, to just even let themselves know and let NFL fans know that they are capable of stringing together a number of good series. And specifically, I'm looking at the offense. The defense is an issue in itself as well, but I also think it's one of those things where the defenses, if they, benefited from having a little bit more semblance of an offense as well, they would be a little bit more, they'd have a little bit more support. The pressure wouldn't be on them quite as much. They're not elite, but they can make plays for sure, and they have a lot of talent. And I think that should be enough to be playoff competitive if the offense can, start to put together some good games, but you look at where they're at this point in the season. I mean, only teams that they've put up more than 20 points against are the Tennessee Titans and the New England Patriots, and that is not going to cut it by any means. Now, you can look at the Bills game as well. Talk about they scored 20 there. They probably should have won, had their kicker made a few kicks. Greg Zuerlein really struggling right now. You can maybe make the same argument for that Broncos game as well. So, I mean, who knows? Maybe they're three field goals made away from being a 4-3 team at this point. That I'm not willing to write them off entirely, but a lot needs to change right now. And I just don't know if Aaron Rodgers is capable of leading that change, especially with pretty little confidence in that coaching staff as a whole right now. But let me know what your thoughts and takeaways were from this game. We are going to be moving on to one of the heavyweight matchups that felt a little flat, but still a very interesting matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. And we're going to be discussing, is Patrick Mahomes fully right this season? What's going on with the lack of explosiveness from the Chiefs? And then on the other side, are the 49ers at a point where they can no longer return after dealing with injury after injury this season, and things continue to get worse on that front? So we're going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.